In this video, I want to consider the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular, but you could take the material in the second half when we get to actually color coding the text and apply it to John as well. You just kind of have to squint real hard while you're doing it. Now, the first thing we need to consider is that generally Mark is assumed to have been written first today, somewhere around 50 AD. Prior to 1800, Matthew was considered written first, but most people accept Mark being written first, and there's a number of reasons for this, and you can read that in the various texts. I don't have time to go into it here. What this means is that when Matthew and Luke come along, somewhere between 60 to 75 AD, they have Mark as a text to work from, or we could say that Mark is known within the churches that they're operating in, and they understand something of the basic structure and content of Mark's gospel. But I probably think that they actually have a copy of Mark in front of them when they're working, because when they cite or they quote, it seems to follow Mark's wording and ordering a little bit too close to just be off the top of their head. What this means then is that Mark, when he records a series of events, let's say A, B, and C, these events, A, B, and C, then, are then picked up within Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Luke will follow the order of Mark. In other words, if Mark has John the Baptist, and then Jesus in Galilee, and then the Sermon on the Mount as an order, these would be particular pericopes or pearls, events from the life of Jesus. When we come over to Matthew and Luke, what we find is that they follow this same general order that Mark has as a general rule. However, they will intersperse other material in between it here, so the actual spacing between them will be different in their accounts. This then brings up the question of material that's unique to Matthew and material that's unique to Luke. We have these highly technical terms of M and L. M, material unique to Matthew. L, material unique to Luke. Highly technical terms. And then we also have another source that we would call Q, and that comes from the German word Quelle, which just means source. And Quelle, or Q material, is material that's in Matthew and Luke, but it's not in Mark. As a general rule, this Q material tends to be just sayings with little narrative event within them, and we'll see why that's significant here in a second. So when we look at sources and material that's unique to Matthew and Luke, one of the things that's unique about this is that when we consider this material, let's say, for example, Luke has events that's unique to him, A, B, and C. He has a great deal of flexibility where he places this, because it's not in Mark and it's not in Matthew, and as long as he puts it within there somewhere that makes sense for how he's teaching his perspective of the life of Christ, it's going to fit. This means, on the other hand, that material that's unique to Matthew also can be placed within his account where he sees fit. When it comes to Q, this is material that's found in both Matthew and Luke. One of the things that we can say is that because it has little narrative or event type references within it, it's just sayings, it gives the various authors, Matthew and Luke, a great deal of flexibility where they place this material, because it's more fluid. It's not tied to the plot or other events around them. You can place these sayings wherever you want. An example of this is would be the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. In Mark's account, we have a very brief reference in Mark chapter 1, verses 12 through 13, that basically say, the Spirit drove Jesus out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and angels ministered to them. In Matthew and Luke, we have some Q material here, in that we actually have a dialogue between Satan and Jesus. Now, in Matthew's account, the three temptations come in this order: turn stone into bread, throw yourself down from the pinnacle, and he's taken up to a high mountain and shown all the kingdoms of the world, and if he worships Satan, this will be given to him. In Luke's account, the order is turn stone into bread, but then he places the last event in Matthew second. In other words, Luke has Satan taking Jesus up onto the high mountain and showing him all the kingdoms of the world. And then the last event is throw yourself down from the temple. Now, why do they change? Why do they have the three events, but they have them in a different order? Well, in Luke's gospel, I think the reason for this is that he places the temptation to throw yourself down from the temple last, because the temple plays a very, very significant role in his gospel. At the start of this, you remember that Zacharias is in the temple presenting the offerings when the angel appears to him and announces the birth of John the Baptist. You've got Jesus being presented in the temple by his parents, and Simon and Anna recognizing him there. You have Jesus as a young boy at 12 years old or so going up into the temple and being lost by his parents there. And then also you need to consider in the book of Acts, the first 5 chapters of the book of Acts really focus on the disciples' ministry in and around the temple. So the temple plays a central role in Luke's gospel, and this is why I think he places it last. Matthew's ordering of events here, with Jesus being taken up onto the high mountain and shown all the kingdoms of the world, I think is placed last because his gospel ends with Jesus coming and appearing to his disciples on the mountain in Galilee and giving the commission to go into all the nations and make disciples of all the nations in the world. So by placing that temptation last in his account, it fits the overall structure of his gospel as well. So what? What's the point of doing all this? Is it just mainly hypothetical and theoretical type of information to consider? But why do the authors put their pearls or the pericopes in the particular order that they do? If Matthew and Luke both use Mark, what difference does their word choice make? Because you'll notice as we go through these, they won't quote him verbatim. There's actually changes that are made in how Luke would record a story from Mark's gospel, and the same with Matthew. So what differences do the word choices make? And then finally, one of the things to consider is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are like watching a post-game show rather than the actual sporting event. We often think that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are like a videotape of, let's say, a Super Bowl or a World Cup soccer match, in that they go from beginning to end exactly how it happened in Jesus' life. But they don't operate that way. These are teaching documents that were used within the early church to teach specific things about the life of Christ. They're more like the post-game wrap-up show where the authors will comment, or the sports commentators will comment on the game and bring out the significance of it rather than giving you that videotape of the game itself. So let's use an example here of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. This is found in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 31. It's also found in Luke 4, 38 through 39. But notice with Matthew, it's moved to chapter 8. So it's moved further along in Matthew's gospel. That's because Matthew is going to have the Sermon on the Mount, which is going to take up almost 3 chapters immediately prior to chapter 8. And then finally, the last thing we need to consider is that when you're doing studies of this, what you want is a synopsis of the 4 Gospels. And the current one is the Revised Standard Version, and it's put out by the American Bible Societies in conjunction with the German Bible Societies. And you want the 2010 edition, and you want the one edited by Kurt Aland. You cannot do this with what is called a harmony of the Gospel. A harmony of the Gospel is exactly what it says. It attempts to harmonize Matthew, Mark, and Luke together. And so by its very nature, it overlooks or it conceals the differences between the authors. A synopsis of the gospel will present the authors side by side, and the one that's produced by the United Bible Societies and American Bible Societies will actually show you not only the story side by side, but actually present it so you can actually see the word parallels. You can't do this with the other synopsises that are put out, and you can't do this with the computer software. So if you are interested in doing further studies like this, there's the text that you need. So let's take a look at a scan I did of the story of Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. This occurs in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 31, as I was saying. And this is a scan right out of it so you can see how it looks. At the very top, it says 87, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. The 87 there just refers to that this is like their 87th pearl or the 87th pericope. It's a way for them just to number and put these side by side. Now, a couple of things that we notice when we do this is that if you look immediately before this story, in both Matthew and Luke, Jesus was teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum, and he healed a demoniac. And then when he leaves the synagogue, he goes and enters Peter's house. In Matthew's account, as I was saying, chapter 7 is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And in chapter 8, Matthew starts a collection of miracle stories. And the ones preceding the healing of Peter's mother-in-law were the healing of lepers and then the healing of the centurion's servant. We'll see why this contextual reference there, in other words, the pearls that he places directly before the story, plays out here. Now, when we do a study like this, we're going to use a color code, and this color code is important because it helps us to actually visually see the difference. In other words, instead of me just saying, oh, look at this, this, and this word, you can actually see by the colors what's going on. And the general accepted color code to this, which was what I did, is I took about 7 or 8 different authors, and 6 out of 8 synoptic scholars, or we could say 6 out of 8 dentists, recommend the following color code. Blue is common in all 3. Yellow, this is material that's found in Mark and Luke. Green, this is found in Mark and Matthew. Pink, this would be Q. It's in Matthew and Luke. And purple is unique to them. Then you could also use lines or arrows if you want to get really creative to show connection between Matthew and Luke or Luke and Mark, or maybe when you're looking at the temptations, have arrows showing how Matthew and Luke switch the second and third temptations. You could also underline or put in dashed lines words that you think are close, but you're not really sure. In other words, you can get creative here. Now, what I've done here is color code the first line here. And you'll notice that if we look at the blue here, and entered house, these 3 words are found in all 3 Gospels here. And so you see how they go across. But if we move a little bit further, let's consider other connections. So if I highlight in yellow what's common between Mark and Luke, you'll notice that he left the synagogue and Simon or of Simon is common between them. That is not found in Matthew's account. And then finally, if we color code purple, what's unique to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you notice that Matthew has a reference to Jesus, and he also calls him Peter, which is different than Mark and Luke. Mark has this immediately there, and Luke has arose and, which I don't think makes a big difference. But it shows you what's unique between the 3 Gospels. So we see what's in common, what Mark and Luke share, and then what is unique to them. Notice also in these first 2 lines here, there's really nothing that is found in Matthew that is not found in Mark, but not in Luke. And so that's why there's no green in the text here at this point in time. Now, if I just skip a little bit further and show you one that I've cooked ahead of time here, you can see how this entire story would get color-coded between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, All three of them share the same basic story structure of Jesus going into the house, the mother-in-law, her suffering from a fever, it leaving her, and this reference to her service. But we can make more specific observations. If we look at Mark and Luke, we notice that about a third of their story they share in common. In other words, it's in yellow. There's very little that Matthew and Luke share in common that's not found. Matthew and Mark share in common that's not found in Luke. Perhaps the best example of this, or the only example, is lying sick with A. That's found in Matthew and Mark, but it's not, this reference to her lying there is not found in Luke. Also, Mark and Luke record references to the other disciples, and they're telling Jesus about Peter's mother-in-law suffering. This is not found in Matthew. Of the three, Matthew is kind of the one not playing well with the others in the sandbox here. He's the most unique in that he omits everyone except for Jesus and the mother-in-law in the story here. Now, what can we say? Let's take a look at Mark's account first. First, we have this reference to immediately. And in Mark's gospel, this use of the word immediate is very typical in his gospel. If you read Mark's gospel, you'd think the entire life of Jesus took place within a week because everything happens immediately. The second thing is, we have this reference to him leaving the synagogue and entering Peter's house, or Simon's house, with him. We have the reference to their telling Jesus about the fever, Jesus taking Peter's mother-in-law by the hand and lifting her up. The fever leaves her. She serves him, or actually she serves them. And we can also say that this story is very culturally appropriate. In other words, a man like Jesus does not enter someone's house without the other males being present there. But he will go in with the other males present, and that's why he's able to go in and then also have this encounter with the woman. Also, we have her taking her by the hand, lifting her up, which is very culturally appropriate. In other words, this is something that one person would do with another. And then finally, her serving them would be a typical act of hospitality where the woman would then serve the male guests within the house, within that culture at that day. If we go over to Luke's account, we can see that he follows Mark's order of stories. He shares almost 30% of the same wording and order as Mark's gospel. We also have this reference to that they besought him. In other words, in Mark's gospel, they tell him about the mother-in-law. In Luke's gospel, they besought him. This adds an urgency that's not found in Mark's gospel. So this is one of these little word changes that I would say is important here. Luke also records that she has a high fever. This is unique to him. It's not found in Mark or Matthew's account. Once again, it's increasing the urgency or the dramatics of this story. In Mark's account, you have that he takes her by the hand and he lifts her up. In Luke's account, though, Jesus stands over her. It's much more authoritarian. It's not the same type of encounter that we see in Mark's account. Also, Jesus rebukes the fever. Now, in Mark's account, when you read this, he takes her by the hand, he lifts her up, and the fever left her. It's not directly pointed out or told how or why the fever leaves her. We see Luke here rebukes the fever, and so he definitely clarifies how this miracle takes place. And then finally, it ends the same way Mark does, with her serving them. Once again, it seems to fit the culture in that day. If we move over to Matthew's account, context is important. He places this within the collection of healing stories after the Sermon on the Mount. That's why you have no reference to leaving the synagogue or the other disciples being present. Second thing is, all the other characters are edited out of this story. This is very, very typical of Matthew. He focuses on Jesus and Jesus only. It's like the Sunday school class for little kids. What's gray, has a fuzzy tail, eats nuts, and lives in a tree. every little kid knows that the correct answer to that is Jesus, because Jesus is the correct answer to every question in Sunday school. The same thing in Matthew's gospel. He leaves everybody out that he can, and he focuses just on Jesus. And so Peter, Andrew, James, and John are all edited out of the story here because they're not significant for Matthew's account. It's about Jesus and Jesus only. Then you have this whole thing of Jesus entering Peter's house. In that culture and that day when Matthew's gospel was written, this would have been highly provocative. A man does not enter another person's house without the males being present there. So you've got this question mark about what is Jesus doing walking into Peter's house without them being there. Also, that he enters in and he sees the woman in bed. That's not culturally appropriate either. But theologically, it's important because no one points out to Jesus that she's sick. Jesus sees this completely on his own. Jesus' touches her hand is very similar to taking her hand in Mark's account, but very different than Luke's rebuking the fever. So you see here where he's following Mark, but it's slightly different. And then finally, at the end of this story, Matthew records that she served him, and Mark and Luke, she served them. I think this is important because as you read the miracle stories in Matthew's account, when people are touched by Christ, when they are healed or they have an encounter with Christ, the natural response in Matthew's account is for them to serve Christ. So he shifts it from the culturally appropriate observation of the woman providing hospitality or food for the guests to Peter's mother-in-law serving Jesus. And it's really kind of phrased in this idea or hinted at here that this is more of a discipleship encounter rather than actually providing meal. So what? What's the summary of all this? The first thing that doing a study like this does is it helps us to realize how important context is. In other words, what is this author saying in this passage with these words? What is Matthew saying when he records this story in this context here? What is Mark saying? What is Luke saying? They're not all saying the same thing. They're all preaching and teaching their churches and their communities, and they want them all to realize a specific aspect or theological concept, interpret and apply something from this story. The final thing that is important in looking at a topic like this is that ideas have consequences. These hypothetical ideas about the relationship between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and how we interpret them, who came first, what order they came in, which stories are placed in what order, and how they actually record the actual words that are recorded when they interpret these stories, show and shape how we should interpret them. So ideas have consequences. The material you're studying in these courses are then going to influence how you interpret and apply and teach the life of Christ to others. And that is the end of this lecture.